When you climb into a B-17 flying fortress at 20,000 feet over enemy territory, every decision matters. Every action could mean the difference between coming home or becoming another statistic in a war that has already claimed too many lives. But sometimes, the most unusual decisions turn out to be the most important ones. This is the story of a young gunner who stuck a mirror on his cannon, and the commander who nearly kicked him out of the war for it. If you're enjoying this story of courage and innovation during World War II, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more incredible true stories from history. The morning of March 14th, 1944, started like any other morning at Thorpe Abbotts Air Base in eastern England. The mist hung low over the runways, thick and grey like wet wool draped across the countryside. Inside the operations briefing room, 27-year-old Captain James Fletcher stood at attention with his crew, listening to the intelligence officer outline their mission for the day. The target was a ball-bearing factory in Schweinfurt, Germany. Deep penetration, maximum danger. Fletcher had been flying combat missions for 8 months now. His face, once boyish and eager, had taken on the hardened look of a man who had seen too much. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his jaw was perpetually tight, as if he was always bracing for the next piece of bad news. He commanded the bomber they called Liberty's Last Stand, a B-17 that had survived 19 missions, each one leaving its mark in the form of patched holes and replaced parts. His crew was good, mostly. Navigator Bill Henderson could find a barn in a snowstorm. Bombardier Tony Marchetti had the steadiest hands Fletcher had ever seen. Radio operator Frank Davies could coax a signal out of a broken set with nothing but willpower. The waist gunners, Mike O'Brien and Carl Johnson, were solid shots. Even the ball turret gunner, the tiny and perpetually nervous Eddie Klein, did his job without complaint. But then there was Sergeant Robert Mitchell, the tail gunner. Mitchell was 20 years old, thin as a reed, with unruly brown hair and eyes that seemed to notice everything. He had joined the crew 2 months ago as a replacement after their previous tail gunner, a veteran named Williams, had been killed over Bremen. Since then, Mitchell had been competent but quiet, keeping mostly to himself. Fletcher appreciated quiet. Quiet meant no problems. The briefing ended, and the crews filed out into the cold morning air. The ground crews were already swarming over the bombers, loading ammunition, checking engines, topping off fuel tanks. Fletcher walked around Liberty's Last Stand, performing his pre-flight inspection with the same methodical care he applied to everything. Every rivet, every panel, every tire. When you trusted a machine with your life and the lives of 9 other men, you did not take shortcuts. He was checking the tail section when he noticed something odd. A small, rectangular mirror, the kind a man might use for shaving, was attached to the side of the tail gun mount with what looked like wire and tape. Fletcher stared at it for a moment, his mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then he felt his jaw tighten even more. He found Mitchell in the equipment shed, adjusting his flight gear. The young gunner looked up as Fletcher approached, and something in the captain's expression made him straighten up immediately. "What is that mirror doing on my airplane, Sergeant?" Fletcher said. His voice was level, but there was steel underneath. Mitchell swallowed hard. "Sir, it's for the gun sight. I can angle it to see targets approaching from below without having to shift my entire position. It gives me an extra few seconds of reaction time." Fletcher felt his anger rising. "You modified military equipment without authorization. You attached unauthorized materials to an aircraft. Do you have any idea how many regulations you just broke?" "Sir, I can take it off right now if you want, but I really think it could help. The tail position has blind spots, and this mirror system I have been working on the angles, and I believe it could give us an advantage when fighters come in low." An advantage. Fletcher almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. You are a replacement gunner with exactly 8 missions under your belt. You think you know better than the engineers who designed this aircraft? You think you know better than the dozens of tail gunners who have flown and fought in B-17s since this war started? Mitchell's face reddened, but he stood his ground. Sir, I am not saying I know better. I am saying I noticed something that might help. The tail gunner position, we are isolated back there. When fighters attack from below and behind, by the time I see them clearly enough to track them, they are already firing. This mirror gives me a wider field of view. Just a few more seconds, but those seconds could matter. Fletcher stared at the young sergeant, his anger warring with something else he could not quite identify. The kid had initiative, he would give him that. But initiative without discipline got people killed. In a bomber crew, everyone had to follow the same procedures, trust the same training, start letting people modify equipment on their own, and chaos followed. "Take it off," Fletcher said flatly. "You fly with standard equipment like everyone else, and when we get back from this mission, you and I are going to have a longer conversation about following orders. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," Mitchell said quietly. His face was carefully neutral now, but Fletcher could see the disappointment in his eyes. They took off at 0800 hours, Liberty's last stand falling into formation with the other bombers of the 381st Bombardment Group. The sky over England was crowded with aircraft, dozens of B-17's climbing and circling, finding their positions in the combat box formation. The roar of hundreds of Wright Cyclone engines was like rolling thunder, a sound that Fletcher felt in his chest as much as heard. As they crossed the English Channel, Fletcher settled into the mental space he occupied during missions, alert but controlled, aware but not anxious. Fear was natural, but you could not let it control you. The moment fear took over, you made mistakes, and mistakes in a bomber over enemy territory were usually fatal. The channel was grey and choppy far below. Fletcher watched the coastline of France appear through breaks in the clouds. Occupied France, enemy territory now. Every mile they flew deeper into Europe brought them closer to German fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The Luftwaffe had been bloodied in recent months, but they were far from beaten. They still had experienced pilots and deadly aircraft, and they defended the Reich with desperate determination. The intercom crackled with routine check-ins. Everyone reported their positions and readiness. In the tail, Mitchell's voice came through, steady and professional. "Tail gunner ready, sir." Fletcher grunted an acknowledgement and pushed thoughts of the mirror incident out of his mind. They had more important things to worry about now. The first 2 hours of the flight passed in tense routine. The bomber formation droned deeper into Germany, Navigator Henderson calling out checkpoints, Bombardier Marchetti preparing his equipment for the bomb run. The sky was relatively clear, visibility good. That was both a blessing and a curse. They could see the target more easily, but German fighters could see them more easily too. "Bogies, 10 o'clock high," the top turret gunner called out. "Focke-Wulf 190s. Fletcher felt his pulse quicken, but his voice remained calm. "Everyone stay alert. Call them out as you see them." The German fighters were diving toward the formation from above, the standard attack profile. They came in fast, cannons blazing, trying to disrupt the defensive fire of the bombers before breaking away. The sky suddenly filled with tracer fire, lines of glowing ammunition arcing through the air in both directions. The B-17s in the formation shuddered and bucked as their gunners returned fire. One fighter flashed past their nose, so close Fletcher could see the pilot's helmet. Marchetti's chin turret guns hammered away at it, but the Focke-Wulf was already gone, rolling away in a tight turn. Another came in from the side, and the waist gunners opened up, their 50 caliber machine guns roaring in the confined space of the fuselage. The attack lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. When the German fighters finally broke off, reforming for another pass, Fletcher did a quick damage check. One engine was running rough, losing oil pressure. Several holes in the wings and fuselage, but nothing critical. They could still fly, still fight. Second wave coming in, the top turret gunner called. More bandits, 6 o'clock level. The second attack was more coordinated. The German fighters came in from multiple angles, trying to split the bombers' defensive fire. Fletcher heard the staccato hammering of guns from every position, felt the bomber shake with the recoil. Spent shell casings rattled and rolled on the deck. The smell of gunpowder and hot metal filled the air, mixing with the cold rushing in through the gun ports. "Captain, we have a problem." Mitchell's voice came over the intercom, tight with stress. 3 fighters breaking off from the main group. They are setting up for a tail attack from low altitude. I can barely track them. "Do your best, Sergeant," Fletcher replied, his attention divided between the fighters ahead and the instruments in front of him. Co-pilot Jim Bradley was handling the controls while Fletcher managed the tactical situation. The tail gun began firing, the distinctive sound different from the other guns, more isolated. Fletcher could picture Mitchell back there in that cramped, cold position, trying to track fast-moving targets with limited visibility. The tail gunner position was vital for defense, but it was also one of the most difficult jobs on the aircraft. "One got through," Mitchell reported, his voice strained. "Minor damage to the tail section, I think. They are coming back around." The formation was taking losses. Fletcher could see 2 bombers already falling out of formation, one trailing smoke from 2 engines, the other with its entire nose section shot away. Tiny figures tumbled from the damaged aircraft, parachutes blossoming white against the grey sky. Each one represented a crew, 10 men, friends and colleagues. Fletcher forced himself not to think about it. Focus on your own aircraft. Keep your own crew alive. The bomb run began as they approached Schweinfurt. This was the most dangerous part of the mission. They had to fly straight and level, no evasive maneuvers, while Marchetti lined up on the target. The bombardier essentially flew the aircraft during this phase, making minute adjustments through the Norden bomb site. Everyone else could only hold formation and pray that the anti-aircraft fire did not find them. Black puffs of flak began appearing in the sky around them, German 88mm guns firing from below. Each burst was an expanding cloud of shrapnel, capable of shredding metal and flesh. The sound was like someone hitting the aircraft with a giant hammer, irregular thumps and bangs as fragments struck the bomber. Fletcher could see holes appearing in the wings, hear the rattle of debris hitting the fuselage. "Steady," Marchetti said over the intercom, his voice utterly calm despite the chaos around them. "Steady. Bomb bay doors open. Almost there." A nearby bomber took a direct hit from flak. One moment it was flying in formation. The next, it was an expanding fireball, debris and bodies tumbling through the sky. Fletcher looked away. He had to look away. If he let himself think about the fact that those were men, real people with families and dreams and futures, he would not be able to function. "Bombs away," Marchetti announced. "Bomb bay doors closing. We are clear." Fletcher immediately put the bomber into a banking turn, heading away from the target area. The entire formation was turning, bombers peeling off in their assigned directions, trying to get out of the flak zone as quickly as possible. Behind them, the ball-bearing factory was already erupting in flames and smoke as hundreds of bombs found their marks. But the mission was not over. They still had to get home, and the German fighters were waiting. The attack came 15 minutes after they left the target area. This time, the Luftwaffe committed everything they had. Focke-Wulf 190s, Messerschmitt 109s, even a few twin-engine 110s armed with rockets. They came from every direction, a coordinated assault designed to destroy as many bombers as possible before the formation could reach the relative safety of the fighter escort range. The sky became a nightmare of tracer fire and explosions. Bombers and fighters tangled in deadly combat. Machines and men locked in a struggle where only survival mattered. Fletcher fought to keep Liberty's last stand in formation, knowing that a lone bomber was a dead bomber. The gunners were firing continuously now, their barrels glowing hot. "Multiple bogeys, 6 o'clock low," Mitchell called out. "They are using the sun. I cannot get a clear shot." Fletcher felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Attacks from 6 o'clock low were the most dangerous. The tail gunner was the only defense, and if Mitchell could not see them clearly, they were in serious trouble. "Do what you can," Fletcher said, hating how inadequate that sounded. The tail gun fired in short bursts, Mitchell trying to anticipate where the fighters would appear. But Fletcher could hear the frustration in the gunner's voice. "Sir, I am firing blind here. They are coming up from below, and by the time I see them in my sight, they are already past my effective range." A line of cannon fire stitched across Liberty's last stand's tail section, shredding metal and shattering glass. The bomber lurched. Fletcher fought the controls, keeping them level. "Status report," he snapped. "Tail gunner, I am okay," Mitchell responded. "But the hydraulics are damaged. I have reduced mobility on the gun." Another fighter came in from below, its guns flashing. This time the rounds walked up the fuselage, and Fletcher heard someone scream over the intercom. "Waist gunner hit," O'Brien called out. "Carl's down. I am moving to his position." Fletcher's mind was racing through calculations. Reduced tail gun mobility, one waist gunner down, multiple fighters targeting their 6 o'clock. They were vulnerable, and the Germans knew it. The next attack could be the one that brought them down. "Captain," Mitchell's voice came over the intercom. Different now, urgent but controlled. "I need permission to reattach that mirror." "Please, sir. I know I can see them better with it. I know I can defend us." Fletcher's first instinct was to refuse. Regulations, procedures, discipline. But then he thought about Carl Johnson, bleeding in the waist of the aircraft. He thought about Williams, the previous tail gunner killed over Bremen. He thought about the 2 bombers he had watched fall out of formation earlier. Men died when you followed the rules, but men also died when you did not. "How long will it take?" Fletcher asked. 2 minutes, maybe 3. I kept it. It is right here in my position. I just need to reattach it. Fletcher made a decision that violated every principle he had been taught about military discipline. "Do it. Do it fast." "Yes, sir." The intercom went silent from the tail position. Fletcher could picture Mitchell working frantically in that cramped space, trying to secure the mirror while the aircraft bucked and shook from continuing attacks. Every second felt like an eternity. Every second they were vulnerable. "More fighters incoming," the top turret gunner called. "They are lining up for another pass." The next 2 minutes were among the longest of Fletcher's life. He listened to his gunners calling out targets, heard the stutter of machine guns, felt the impacts as enemy rounds hit the bomber. Each impact could be the one that hit a fuel tank or severed a control cable or killed another crew member. And all he could do was fly straight, hold formation, and wait. "Mirror is attached." Mitchell's voice finally came through, testing sight lines. "Captain, I can see them. I can see them coming up from below. There are 2 109s setting up for an attack run right now." "Light them up, Sergeant," Fletcher said. The tail gun opened fire, longer bursts now, more confident. Fletcher could hear the difference in Mitchell's voice as he called out his targets. "Target 1, breaking left. Target 2, I am tracking. Got him, I got him." Through his window, Fletcher saw a Messerschmitt 109 trailing smoke, spinning out of control. The pilot ejected, his parachute deploying as the fighter tumbled toward the ground. Mitchell had scored a kill. "Another one coming in," Mitchell reported. "Same angle. I have him in the mirror, firing." The tail gun hammered again. This time, the German fighter broke off its attack early, rolling away before it could get into effective firing range. Mitchell had forced it to abort. That was almost as good as a kill, because it meant the attack had failed. Over the next hour, the attacks continued. But Liberty's last stand was no longer an easy target. Mitchell was calling out threats earlier, engaging them sooner, forcing the German pilots to break off or take their chances against accurate defensive fire. 3 more times he scored hits on attacking fighters. Twice he drove them off before they could even fire. The other crew members noticed. Fletcher could hear it in their voices over the intercom. There was a new confidence, a sense that the tail position was no longer a weak point, but a strong one. When men believed they could defend themselves, they fought harder, more effectively. As they crossed back into France, the fighter attacks finally tapered off. The Luftwaffe had lost too many aircraft, and the remaining German pilots were low on fuel and ammunition. The bomber formation, battered and reduced in number, limped toward England. Behind them, smoke columns marked the locations of downed bombers and fighters, graves scattered across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Fletcher allowed himself to relax slightly, though he knew they were not safe until the wheels touched down on English soil. He did a status check of the crew. Co-pilot Bradley was fine, navigator Henderson was fine, bombardier Marchetti was fine, radio operator Davies was fine, top turret gunner was fine, ball turret gunner Klein was fine. Waist gunner O'Brien was fine. Waist gunner Johnson was injured but stable. O'Brien had managed to stop the bleeding and patch him up. Tail gunner Mitchell, what is your status? Fletcher asked. I am good, sir, came the reply. Cold, tired, but good. The mirror is still attached and functioning. Fletcher looked at Bradley, his co-pilot. Bradley raised his eyebrows in a silent question. Fletcher shook his head slightly. They would deal with it on the ground. The English coast appeared through the clouds, and Fletcher felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. They had made it. Not everyone had. Several bombers from their group were missing, but Liberty's last stand and her crew were coming home. That was all any of them could ask for. They landed at Thorpe Abbotts just after 1500 hours. The bomber was a mess, riddled with holes, one engine completely shot, hydraulics damaged, but it had brought them home. As the crew climbed out, Fletcher could see the ground crews already swarming over the aircraft, assessing the damage, beginning the repairs that would get it ready to fly again. Johnson was taken away on a stretcher, heading to the base hospital. The wound was not life-threatening, but he would be grounded for a while. The rest of the crew stood together on the tarmac, exhausted, running on adrenaline and relief. They had survived another mission. Fletcher found Mitchell checking over the tailgun position. The mirror was still there, slightly bent and scorched, but intact. The young gunner was carefully documenting its positioning with a pencil and notepad, writing down angles and sightlines. Sergeant Mitchell, a word, Fletcher said. Mitchell turned, and for a moment, Fletcher saw fear in his eyes. The young man was expecting to be disciplined, possibly removed from flight status. His hands were shaking, though whether from cold, exhaustion, or nervousness, Fletcher could not tell. They walked away from the aircraft, out of earshot of the ground crews. The late afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the airfield. Somewhere in the distance, another formation of bombers was coming into land, the day's missions winding down. I've been thinking about what to say to you, Fletcher began. By every regulation in the manual, I should write you up for unauthorized modification of military equipment. I should recommend disciplinary action. At minimum, I should remove that mirror and order you never to try something like that again. He paused, watching Mitchell's face. The young gunner was standing at attention, waiting for the hammer to fall. But I am not going to do any of that, Fletcher continued. Do you know why? Mitchell shook his head, not trusting his voice. Because you saved lives today. Maybe you saved this entire crew. Those fighters that were attacking from below, you stopped them. You drove them off or shot them down, and you did it because you saw a problem and you found a solution. That takes initiative, that takes intelligence, and in combat, that is exactly what we need. Fletcher could see the surprise on Mitchell's face, the confusion. He pressed on. However, and this is important, Sergeant, you went about it the wrong way. You cannot just modify equipment without authorization. You cannot make changes to an aircraft without telling anyone. That is not initiative. That is recklessness. If that mirror had come loose during flight, it could have damaged the tail surfaces. It could have gotten you killed. Yes, sir, Mitchell said quietly. I did not think about that. I should have requested permission first. I should have explained what I wanted to do and why. Yes, you should have. Fletcher's voice softened slightly. But I also understand why you did not. You are new to this crew. You replaced a veteran gunner who was killed in action. You probably felt like you had to prove yourself, had to show that you were worthy of the position. You thought if you asked permission, I would just say no, without considering it. That is exactly what I thought, sir, Mitchell admitted. Fletcher nodded. And you were probably right. I would have said no, but I would have been wrong. And that is something I need to think about. How many other good ideas have I dismissed because they did not fit the standard procedures? How many times have I valued following rules over finding better solutions? He looked back at Liberty's last stand, at the ground crews working on the damaged bomber. The tail section was particularly torn up, evidence of the intense fighting that had occurred there. Here is what we are going to do, Fletcher said. Tomorrow you are going to write up a detailed report about your mirror system. How it works, why it works, what the advantages are, what the potential risks are. You are going to include diagrams and measurements. Then you and I are going to take that report to the engineering officer and request official approval for the modification. Mitchell's eyes widened. You want to make it official? If it works, and today proved that it does, then it should be available to every tail gunner in the group, maybe in the entire bomber command. How many lives could we save if every B-17 tail gunner had improved visibility? How many aircraft could we bring home? Sir, I do not know what to say, Mitchell stammered. Say you will write that report. Say you will do it by the book this time. Follow proper channels, get proper authorization. Can you do that? Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. Good. Fletcher extended his hand. Mitchell shook it, his grip firm despite the tremor in his fingers. You did well today, Sergeant, Fletcher said. The kill you scored, the attacks you drove off, that was excellent gunnery. But more than that, you thought outside the box. You saw a problem, and you solved it. That is the kind of thinking that wins wars. Thank you, sir. Mitchell's voice was thick with emotion. I just wanted to contribute, to be worthy of this crew. You are worthy, Fletcher assured him. You proved that today. They walked back toward the operations building together, neither speaking. Around them, the airbase was settling into its evening routine. Ground crews working on aircraft, pilots and crew members heading to debriefing, the smell of cooking food drifting from the mess hall, the ordinary activities of a military base at war. The debriefing session lasted 2 hours. Fletcher and his crew sat in a crowded room with the other returning crews, recounting the mission while intelligence officers took notes. How many fighters encountered? What were the tactics used? Where were the flak concentrations? How was the visibility over the target? Was the bomb run successful? When Fletcher mentioned Mitchell's mirror system and the improvement in tailgun effectiveness, the intelligence officer's eyebrows went up. The officer made several notes, asked detailed questions about how it worked. Fletcher saw several other pilots and gunners listening with interest. After the debriefing, the crew dispersed to their various activities. Some headed to the mess hall, others went to write letters home. A few went to the flight line to check on their aircraft one more time, a nervous ritual many crews developed. Fletcher went to his quarters, a small room he shared with 3 other officers. He sat on his bunk and pulled out the letter he had been writing to his wife, Margaret. She was back in Oregon with their 2-year-old daughter, Sarah. He had not seen them in over a year, not since he shipped out for England. He tried to write every week, though sometimes the missions came so frequently that he fell behind. Dear Margaret, he wrote, we flew another mission today. I cannot tell you where we went or what we hit, the sensors would not allow it, but I can tell you we made it back safely, all of us. Well, almost all of us. Carl Johnson caught some shrapnel, but the doc says he will be fine. He paused, thinking about what else to say. He could not tell her about the fear, the constant stress, the nightmares that came almost every night. He could not tell her about watching bombers explode, about friends who did not come back, about the weight of command and the decisions that meant life or death for 10 men. She knew, of course. She was not naive. But there were some things you did not put in letters home. Something interesting happened today. He continued writing. One of our gunners, a young sergeant named Mitchell, came up with an innovation that probably saved our lives. It made me realize that I've been so focused on following procedures and maintaining discipline that I might have been missing opportunities to actually improve how we fight this war. It is a hard balance, maintaining order while also encouraging initiative. I am still learning how to find that balance. He wrote more about the crew, about small details of daily life on the base, about his hopes that the war would end soon and he could come home. Then he sealed the letter and set it aside to be mailed in the morning. That night, Fletcher lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Around him, the other officers in the room were already asleep, exhausted from their own missions. But Fletcher's mind would not quiet. He kept replaying the day's events, analyzing his decisions, wondering what he could have done differently. The truth was, Mitchell had been right and Fletcher had been wrong. The young gunner had seen a real problem and devised a practical solution, and Fletcher had almost punished him for it, almost removed the one advantage that had kept them alive during those critical moments over Germany. That was not leadership. That was just blind adherence to rules. But Mitchell had also been wrong in how he went about it. Making unauthorized modifications to an aircraft was dangerous and could have had serious consequences. There had to be a middle ground, a way to encourage innovation while maintaining safety and discipline. Fletcher decided that starting tomorrow, he would make changes to how he commanded his crew. He would make it clear that ideas and suggestions were welcome, that he wanted them to think creatively about how to do their jobs better. But he would also make it clear that those ideas had to go through proper channels, had to be evaluated for safety and effectiveness before being implemented. The next morning, Mitchell delivered his report. It was thorough and well written, with detailed diagrams showing the mirror placement, sightlines, and coverage angles. He had even included calculations of the improved reaction time and target tracking. Fletcher was impressed by the level of detail and thought that had gone into it. They took the report to Captain Wilson, the group engineering officer. Wilson was a practical man in his 30s, an engineer from Detroit who had worked in the automotive industry before the war. He listened to their presentation with interest, occasionally asking questions or requesting clarification. After reviewing the report, Wilson leaned back in his chair and thought for a moment. Then he smiled. "This is good work, Sergeant," he said. "Really good work. The concept is sound, and your implementation seems practical. I want to test this properly before we roll it out to the entire group, but I think you are onto something here." "Really, sir?" Mitchell could not hide his excitement. "Really?" Wilson looked at Fletcher. "Captain, with your permission, I would like to install this mirror system on several aircraft and have the tail gunners test it over the next few missions. We will collect data on effectiveness, look for any problems or issues, and if it works as well as Sergeant Mitchell claims, we will recommend it for wider adoption." "You have my full permission," Fletcher said, "and my recommendation. I saw it work yesterday. It made a real difference." The testing program began immediately. Mitchell's mirror system was installed on 5 aircraft, and the tail gunners were given specific instructions on how to use it and what data to collect. Over the next 2 weeks, those aircraft flew multiple missions, and the results were consistently positive. Tail gunners reported earlier detection of attacking fighters. They scored more hits and forced more enemy aircraft to break off attacks. Most importantly, aircraft with the mirror system suffered less damage to their tail sections, suggesting that they were engaging threats more effectively. The data was clear and compelling. By early April, the mirror system was approved for installation on every B-17 in the 381st Bombardment Group. By May, other groups were requesting the specifications so they could install it on their own aircraft. By June, it was becoming standard equipment throughout the 8th Air Force Bomber Command. Mitchell became something of a celebrity on the base. Other crew members would stop him to ask questions about how the system worked. Engineering officers from other groups visited to see it in person. He even gave a presentation to the group commander, a full colonel, explaining the technical details. Throughout it all, he remained modest and professional, always careful to credit the entire crew and particularly Captain Fletcher for supporting the innovation. For Fletcher, the experience was transformative. He began actively soliciting ideas from his crew, creating an environment where people felt comfortable suggesting improvements. Some ideas were impractical or unsafe and had to be rejected. But others were valuable, like the Bombardier's suggestion for a better way to organize charts and maps, or the radio operator's improved checklist for emergency procedures. Liberty's Last Stand flew its 25th mission on April 19, 1944. 25 missions was the magic number, the threshold after which a crew could complete their tour and rotate home. It had taken Fletcher 8 months to reach this point, 8 months of flying into hostile skies, of seeing friends die, of making life or death decisions. The final mission was to Berlin itself, deep into the heart of the Reich. It was dangerous and costly, with heavy flak and determined fighter opposition. But Liberty's Last Stand and her crew made it through. When they landed back at Thorpe Abbotts that evening, fire trucks sprayed water over the aircraft in celebration, a tradition for crews completing their tours. Fletcher gathered his crew for the last time on the hard stand where Liberty's Last Stand was parked. These men had become closer to him than brothers. They had shared fear and triumph, had trusted each other with their lives, had survived together when so many others had not. "I want to say something to all of you," Fletcher began. His voice was rough with emotion. "We made it, all of us. 10 men went up on the first mission, and 10 men are standing here after the last one. In this war, at this time, that is extraordinary. That is almost miraculous." He looked at each man in turn, meeting their eyes. "We made it because we were good at our jobs. We made it because we trusted each other. We made it because we worked together as a team. But we also made it because we were willing to adapt, to learn, to find better ways of doing things. We did not just follow the manual, we improved on it." His gaze settled on Mitchell. "And I want to particularly acknowledge Sergeant Mitchell. The mirror system he developed is now saving lives across the entire Bomber Command. Tail gunners throughout the 8th Air Force are coming home because of his innovation. That is a contribution that will outlast this war, that will be remembered long after we are all gone." Mitchell's face reddened, but he stood a little straighter. Fletcher continued, "What I learned from Sergeant Mitchell is that leadership is not about rigidly enforcing rules. It is about empowering people to be their best, to contribute their ideas, to solve problems. I was wrong to initially reject his mirror system. I was thinking like a bureaucrat instead of a leader. He taught me to be better, and I am grateful for that." The crew stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Fletcher's words settling over them. Then O'Brien, always the one to break tension, spoke up. "Does this mean we get to go home now, sir?" Everyone laughed, the tension breaking. "Yes," Fletcher said with a smile, "it means we get to go home." But the story of Mitchell's mirror did not end there. As it spread throughout the Bomber Command, engineers began to refine and improve the concept. Better mirrors were manufactured specifically for this purpose. Mounting systems were developed that were more robust and adjustable. Training programs were created to teach tail gunners how to use the enhanced visibility effectively. By late 1944, the mirror system was standard equipment on every American heavy bomber in Europe. It was even adapted for use in the Pacific Theater on B-29 Superfortress bombers. Post-war analysis would estimate that it contributed to a 15% reduction in tail gun vulnerabilities, which translated to hundreds of aircraft and thousands of crew members saved. Mitchell himself was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his innovation and for his combat record. The citations specifically mentioned his initiative in developing equipment that enhanced bomber defensive capabilities. He completed his tour and returned to the United States, where he was assigned to a training unit teaching new tail gunners. After the war, he used his GI Bill benefits to study engineering at MIT. He eventually worked for Boeing, contributing to the design of post-war military aircraft. Throughout his career, he was known for encouraging innovation and for listening to the ideas of technicians and operators, the people who actually use the equipment in the field. Fletcher returned to Oregon and rejoined his wife and daughter. He struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though at the time it was just called the strain of combat. He had nightmares about falling bombers and exploding fighters. He woke up at night hearing the sound of machine guns and flak bursts, but slowly, with Margaret's patient support, he learned to live with the memories. He became a high school teacher, teaching history and occasionally sharing stories from his time in the war. He never glorified combat, never made it seem exciting or glamorous. Instead, he talked about the fear, the losses, the weight of responsibility. But he also talked about courage, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things under terrible circumstances. And he always talked about Mitchell's mirror. It became his favorite teaching story, an example of how innovation could come from anywhere, how junior people often saw problems that senior people missed, how rigid adherence to rules and procedures could blind you to better solutions. Years later, in 1967, Fletcher was invited to speak at an Air Force base about his experiences during World War II. The audience included young officers training to be bomber pilots. After his formal presentation, during the question and answer session, a young lieutenant raised his hand. "Sir," the lieutenant asked, "what was the most important lesson you learned during the war?" Fletcher thought for a moment, then smiled. "I learned that leadership is about creating an environment where people feel empowered to identify problems and propose solutions. I learned that sometimes the best ideas come from the newest and most junior members of the team, the ones who are not yet stuck in old patterns of thinking. And I learned that my job as a leader was not to have all the answers, but to recognize good answers when I saw them and to give people the support they needed to implement those answers." He paused, remembering that morning at Thorpe Abbott's, when he had almost punished Mitchell for unauthorized modifications. "There was a young sergeant on my crew," Fletcher continued, "who taught me that lesson the hard way. He saw a problem with the tailgun position visibility. He came up with a solution using just a mirror and some wire, and I almost kicked him out for it because he had not followed proper procedure. If I had done that, if I had let my attachment to rules and regulations override common sense, a lot of people would have died who did not need to die. So I learned to be flexible, to listen, to value innovation even when it came in unexpected forms." After the talk, several young officers approached Fletcher to ask follow-up questions. One of them mentioned that he had read about the mirror system in a technical history of World War II bomber development. Another said his father had been a tail gunner in the Pacific and had used a similar system on his B-29. As Fletcher drove home that evening, He thought about how much the world had changed since the war. Jets had replaced propeller aircraft, missiles had replaced machine guns, but the fundamental principles of leadership remained the same. Listen to your people, value their ideas, create an environment where innovation can flourish. Those lessons were timeless. Mitchell and Fletcher stayed in touch over the years, exchanging Christmas cards and occasional letters. They met in person a few times at reunions of the 381st Bombardment Group. At those gatherings, surrounded by other veterans who had shared the experience of combat in the skies over Europe, they would talk about the war, about the crew of Liberty's last stand, about the missions they had flown together. At one reunion in the early 1980s, Mitchell pulled Fletcher aside for a private conversation. They stood outside the hotel watching the sunset, two old men with silver hair and lined faces. "I have been thinking a lot lately about that mirror," Mitchell said, "about the whole situation. You know, I have spent 40 years telling that story, about how I developed an innovation that saved lives. But the older I get, the more I realize that the real story is not about the mirror. It is about you." Fletcher looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" Mitchell turned to face him. "The mirror was just a piece of metal and some wire. Anyone could have thought of that. The important thing was that you were willing to admit you were wrong. You were willing to change your mind and support something that violated your principles about discipline and procedure. That took real courage, maybe more courage than any of us showed in combat." He continued, "I have managed people in my career. I have been in leadership positions. And I know how hard it is to admit you are wrong, especially in front of the people you command. Your ego gets involved, your sense of authority. It is easier to double down on a bad decision than to admit you made a mistake. But you did not do that. You put the mission and the crew ahead of your ego. That is what real leadership looks like." Fletcher felt his eyes getting wet. He blinked rapidly, looking away. "We all did what we had to do," he said quietly. "You with your innovation, me with my support, the rest of the crew with their skills and courage. That is how we survived." Mitchell put his hand on Fletcher's shoulder. "I just wanted you to know that I have always appreciated what you did. Not just supporting the mirror system, but the way you treated me after. You could have taken credit. You could have presented it as your idea. But you made sure everyone knew it came from me. You let me brief the engineering officer. You put my name on all the reports. You made sure I got the recognition. That meant everything to me." Fletcher gripped Mitchell's hand. "You earned it, every bit of it. I was just smart enough not to stand in your way." They stood together in comfortable silence, two old warriors, remembering a time when they were young, when the world was at war, when a simple mirror on a machine gun had made all the difference. Liberty's last stand never flew again after Fletcher and his crew completed their tour. The aircraft was too damaged, too worn out from 25 missions over enemy territory. It was salvaged for parts, its metal recycled into other aircraft. But photographs of it survived, showing the distinctive nose art and the rows of mission markers on the fuselage. And in those photographs, if you look closely at the tail section, you can see a small rectangular mirror attached to the gun mount. It does not look like much, just a simple modification, the kind of field-expedient solution that soldiers and airmen have been coming up with since warfare began. But that mirror represents something larger. It represents the willingness to question established procedures. It represents the courage to propose new solutions. It represents leadership that values innovation over rigid adherence to rules. It represents a crew that survived because they were willing to adapt and improve. The veterans of World War II are almost all gone now. Fletcher passed away in 1993, Mitchell in 2006. The aircraft they flew are in museums or scrapyards. The bases they flew from have been repurposed or abandoned, but the lessons they learned remain relevant. In any organization, in any endeavor, the best ideas do not always come from the top. Sometimes they come from the newest person, the one who sees things with fresh eyes, who has not yet learned that certain problems are supposed to be unsolvable. The challenge for leaders is to create an environment where those ideas can be heard, where innovation is encouraged, where people feel empowered to speak up even when their ideas challenge established ways of doing things. That is the real legacy of Mitchell's Mirror. Not the specific technical innovation, but the broader principle it represents. Listen to your people, value their contributions, be willing to admit when you are wrong. Support good ideas regardless of where they come from. That is how you build effective teams. That is how you win wars. That is how you change the world. And sometimes that is how you survive.